They told her the fire had swallowed everything. 3 winters ago, Ranger Claire Dawson had stood helpless as flames devoured the Wyoming forest. Her Mustang, Storm, vanished into that inferno, gone forever, or so she was made to believe. But fate has a cruel way of circling back. On a bone-cutting December night, at a rundown town auction, she saw him, scarred, trembling. His spirit broken, sold for $1 as if his life meant nothing. Claire's hands shook as she raised her bid, thinking she was saving the horse she once loved. What she didn't know was that in leading Storm out of that pen, she was also leading herself into a secret that Jackson Hollow had buried deep in its frozen soil. A secret that would claw its way to the surface, tearing apart the quiet town and exposing betrayals Claire never imagined. The mountains cradled Jackson Hollow like a hidden wound. Tucked into a basin, carved by wind and ice, the town lived small 300 souls, give or take, its streets etched with the stubborn lines of survival. Snow came early, stayed late, and blanketed everything in a silence so thick it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Main Street looked as if it had been pulled from another century. Weathered logs, crooked storefronts, a tired barber pole still spinning against time. Dale's taproom breathed smoke and laughter most nights, while Mary's general store kept the shelves filled with nails, milk, and gossip in equal measure. At the far end, the church hunched like an old man, its steeple still bent from a storm no one ever bothered to fix. As Christmas neared, colored bulbs strung across rooftops, pine wreaths nailed to doors, red ribbons knotted to fences. It gave the town an illusion of warmth, though underneath, the hush remained. Visitors called it peaceful. Locals knew better. Silence here wasn't peace, it was the sound of secrets keeping watch. In Jackson Hollow, storms didn't just trap people indoors. They trapped the truth. Families clung to their land, to their work, to their silence. Outsiders were greeted with cautious smiles. Their names passed quietly across back porches and church pews. And when Claire Dawson came to stay, people noticed. What they didn't expect was that Claire's return with her scarred Mustang would shake more than the snow from the rooftops. It would rattle the bones of the town itself. And before long, someone in Jackson Hollow would decide if Storm had survived the fire. Maybe Claire wasn't meant to. Not judged exactly, just watched, measured, held at a distance, the way the mountains themselves seemed to hold the town. Claire Dawson was 34, a ranger for the Bridger-Teton National Forest, and the sort of woman who carried silence like a companion. She was tall and lean, her frame hardened by years of hiking ridges and carrying packs through snow fields. Her face bore the weather of long days outside, skin tanned and freckled, a jawline sharpened by wind. Her eyes were hazel, but most people remembered them as steady more than their color. Steady in a way that made you feel both safe and unsettled. She tied her dark brown hair back tight, not out of vanity, but because loose strands annoyed her when the wind kicked up. Her cabin stood on the edge of the forest 2 miles outside town, along Black Pine Road. Built from pine logs darkened. With age, it had a rock chimney that leaned slightly and windows that rattled when the wind pressed hard. To Claire, it was enough, a roof of fire and a place to close the world out at night. She lived alone. No husband, no children, no family within 3 states. If asked, she would shrug and say her work was her family. The woods, the wildlife, the job of keeping them safe. The townsfolk respected her. They nodded when she walked into Mary's store, tipped their hats at the post, an office. Parents told their children she was the reason the trails stayed clear and the wildfires stayed checked. Yet, respect did not mean familiarity. Claire spoke little, laughed less, and carried herself like a woman always half in another place. The children whispered nicknames, the quiet ranger, the mountain lady. Adults said she was reliable but distant, the sort of neighbor you trusted to show up in a crisis, but not the one you invited for supper. And Claire was fine with that. Distance was safer. Her days began with coffee as black as midnight, drunk on the porch, even when frost glazed the railing. She logged her patrols in a weather-beaten notebook. The handwriting neat, the notes sparse but exact. Afternoons often found her out on the ridge lines with binoculars, checking for smoke or stray hunters. Evenings she sat by the fire with a book, though more often than not she found herself staring into the flames, caught in thoughts she couldn't read her way out of. It wasn't that she disliked people. She simply lived with a grief that never loosened its grip. 3 winters earlier, she had found the Mustang. Or perhaps it had found her. Storm was his name. He was cold black, Wildorn, one of the untamed herds that roamed the Wyoming basins, a creature of muscle and defiance. Claire had come across him during a patrol when she heard thrashing in a gulch and discovered him tangled in an asco, illegal snare meant for elk. His flanks were eldered in sweat, his nostrils wide with panic, his hooves bloody from the struggle. She had spoken to him as she cut the wire, calm, steady, letting her voice do the work her hands could not. When the trap gave way, Storm collapsed into the snow, too exhausted to run. For weeks, she tended him, not as a pet. Never that wild horses belonged to the wild. But Storm lingered near her cabin as he healed, and something unspoken bound in them. He followed her on patrols, head-high steps, deliberate, keeping pace along the tree line. The townsfolk marveled at it, at the ranger and the wild Mustang, a peer no one could quite understand. Children sketched them in school. Old ranchers muttered about omens. Claire didn't care. Storm was strength and freedom embodied, and for the first time in her life, she felt less alone. Then came the fire. It started high in the canyon, whipped by dry winds into a wall of flame that consumed everything in its path. Claire had been out that day, riding with Storm, to check a ridge where campers had been reported. She remembered the crackle turning into a roar, the smoke swallowing the sun, and the world reduced to red and black. Storm carried her through heat and falling ash, his muscles trembling under her weight until the fire closed in from all sides. She had survived barely. She remembered leaping from the saddle, stumbling toward a break in the flames, screaming for the horse to follow. She remembered the terror in his eyes, the sound of his scream, the piercing whinny that cut through the inferno, and then nothing. When she awoke in a hospital bed days later, she was told that the blaze had consumed thousands of acres. Crews found bones and collars, charred remains of animals caught in the path. Of the black Mustang, nothing was Peter left. Claire had searched anyway. She spent weeks combing the burn scar, calling his name into the ash. She found hoof prints once, or thought she did, but they led nowhere. She found a patch of scorched earth where she swore she heard his voice, though it might have been the wind. When snow finally covered the land, she stopped looking. Everyone told her to let go. She nodded, but inside, she never did. In Jackson Hollow, people said Storm was gone. Claire knew only that he was missing, and missing to her was a wound that never healed. Life since then had been a half-life. The cabin felt empty, without the sound of hooves against the porch, without the shadow of a great black shape outside her window at dusk. Her patrols became mechanical. She walked the trails, marked her logs, but each bend of the path carried the ache of absence. Sometimes, when snow lay deep across the meadow, she swore she saw him, a dark figure on the ridge, man tossing in the wind. She would blink, and he was gone. The silence of Jackson Hollow in winter became her mirror. The streets at night, hushed under strings of colored bulbs, felt like the quiet inside her chest. Neighbors laughed in their kitchens. Children sledded down hills. But Claire walked home alone to her cabin and the fire that no longer warmed. She kept her grief tucked tight, as disciplined as the creases in her uniform. Work gave her a reason to rise each morning, but joy, true joy, had left with the Mustang. Sometimes she sat by the fire with a hand on the old saddle stored in the corner. The leather cracked the cinch, still bearing soot from that last ride. She would trace the marks with her fingers and whisper, "I should have saved you." In those moments, the forest outside seemed to lean closer, as if listening, as if keeping her confession. To the townsfolk, she was the quiet ranger. To herself, she was a woman, trapped in an unfinished story, haunted by the ghost of a horse she could not bury. And though she didn't know it yet, that story was about to stir again. The winter fair had set Jackson Hollow's main street ablaze with color. Strings of bulbs swung between rooftops, glowing amber and red in the thin December light. Children darted between booths, clutching candied apples and bags of kettle corn. The smell of hot cider drifted thick through the air, mixing with pine smoke from barrels where men warmed their hands. Wooden signs, hand-painted with snowflakes and reindeer, flapped against the wind. The town was small, but on nights like this, it felt alive, a living thing, huddled together against the cold. Claire Dawson moved quietly through. The crowd, her collar pulled high, hat tugged low. She wasn't there for the festivities. Rangers were expected to show face, keep an eye on livestock displays, make sure no one got careless with fire near the hay bales. Mostly, though, she walked because it kept her from thinking. The laughter, the music from a fiddle band under the awning, the smell of roasted chestnuts, all of it belonged to a world. She hovered outside of watching, but never entering. The auction pen sat at the far end of the street near the cattle stalls. Rough wooden rails had been hammered together to hold the animals brought in. For sale. Ox and a few dairy cows, a handful of horses. The air here was harsher, full of snorts and stamping hooves, the low cry of a calf missing its mother. A knot of townsfolk pressed close to the ring, waving mittened hands when the auctioneer barked out numbers. Claire paused at the edge, meaning only to pass by. Her boots crunched over packed snow. She had no reason to linger. But then the auctioneer's voice cut sharp over the den. Next up, who'll give me a bid for this one? From behind the gate, a shadow lurched forward. A horse, black thin, stumbling, as though the ground tilted beneath him, was shoved into the pen. His coat hung in patches tangled with burrs, scarred in strange places. His ribs stood out, stark beneath his skin. A long, raw line scored his flank. The kind of wound that never healed clean. Claire's breath caught hard in her chest. It couldn't be. The animal lifted his head, and for an instant through the gaunt frame and the ragged mane she saw him. The curve of the neck, the stubborn set of his ears, and then the eyes deep. Dark, searching eyes she had seen 1,000 times in the forest. Eyes she had sworn were lost to fire. Storm? The name left her lips in a whisper only she could hear. Her heart slammed. For 3 years she had buried him in her memory, told herself he was gone. But here he was, alive, broken, and dragged. Out like Refu. Storm stumbled in the straw sides, heaving nostrils wide as if the air itself hurt to breathe. He turned his head, scanning the crowd in restless jerks, until his gaze found hers. For a moment, the world seemed a narrow sound falling away. His eyes locked on Claire, and something flickered there. Not confusion, not fear, but recognition. Claire surged forward, her boots sliding in the snow. She pressed against the railing only to have 2 men block her with outstretched arms. "Back off," Ranger 1 said. "Only buyers get close." She didn't move, didn't blink. She couldn't look away from Storm. The Mustang's ears twitched, and a shiver ran down his emaciated body. The man who stepped up beside the horse looked nothing like the image Claire carried of Storm's captor. He was just a rancher, middle-aged, thick around the middle layers of flannel, straining against his belly. His beard was patchy, his cap stained with grease. He spat into the snow, then barked a laugh when Storm sagged to his knees. "This one's worthless," he said to the crowd. "Can't pull, can't ride, eats more than he's worth. Better off hauled for meat." Laughter rippled through the audience. Few men elbowed each other, shaking their heads. "Tell you what," the rancher went on, his voice oily. "I'll let him go, for $1. Scrap price, less than a sack of nails." Claire's hands clenched the rail until her knuckles burned. "Do you even know what you have?" she demanded, her voice low but edged with steel. The man sneered. "A pile of bones with a bad attitude. That's all? He saved lives in the fire." Claire shot back. "He carried me through when the ridge went up. That scar on his side. That's not weakness. That's proof of what he survived." The rancher snorted, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Lady words don't fill a stomach. You want him? Take him. I'll be glad to see the back of him." The crowd muttered, voices carrying sharp through the frosty air. "She's lost her mind," a woman whispered loudly. "That horse is half dead." $8 too much for a bag of bones," another man said, chuckling. "Look at her ready to cry over junk. Someone else." Jared. A few stood silent, sympathy in their eyes, but none spoke in her defense. To them, Storm was nothing but trouble. A lame, scarred Mustang, not worth hay or shelter. Claire felt the heat of their judgment press against her skin. She forced her breath steady. The world thought her a fool. Let them. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her wallet. Inside, folded between old receipts and a gas card, was a single crumpled dollar bill. She smoothed it with her thumb, then stepped forward and held it out. The rancher stared, then barked a laugh. It sprayed spit. "Congratulations," he said, snatching the bill. "You just bought yourself a corpse." The crowd erupted, some with laughter, some with disbelief. A few children pointed eyes wide. Claire ignored them. All. She pushed open the gate, grabbed the frayed rope, tied Crewy around Storm's muzzle. He trembled, his knees buckling, but when she whispered, "Easy boy, it's me," he steadied. His ears flicked toward her voice, and he took a halting step forward. "Not much use left in him," the rancher called after her. "But hey, at least she got a bargain." Claire didn't look back. The snow had begun again by the time she led Storm away from the fairgrounds. The lamps strung along Main Street blurred in the flurries, turning the world into a haze of light and shadow. Storm limped beside her, each breath, wheezing, but his head stayed near her shoulder as though tethered by something deeper than rope. People turned to watch as she passed. Some shook their heads, some whispered, a few laughed openly. Claire kept her eyes forward, jaw tight. She felt the tremor in Storm's muscles through the lead robe. She felt his, weight leaning toward her, seeking something familiar in the storm of sound and snow. At the edge of the street, she opened the trailer hitched to her truck. Storm bulked, his legs stiff, but when she laid a hand against his scarred flank, he drew a ragged breath and climbed in. The drive back to her cabin was slow. Snow fell thick, muffling the tires on gravel. Claire kept glancing into the side mirror, watching Storm sway in the trailer's dim light. His eyes were open, fixed on the world outside, as though afraid to close them. By the time she turned up the narrow road to her cabin, the night had settled hard. The trees pressed close, their branches heavy with snow. Smoke curled from her chimney, a thin promise of warmth. She parked, climbed out, opened the trailer. Storm hesitated, his hooves slipping on the icy ground. He lowered his head, then took a step, then another. Claire walked beside him up the porch, past the door he had known years before. Snow still clung to Claire's coat when she pushed the cabin door wide. The hinges groaned in their familiar way, a sound that had greeted her every night for years. Heat wafted out from the embers she'd banked before leaving faint, but enough to soften the edge of cold. Storm followed behind her. His steps were slow, uneven. His head lowered as though the weight of the years pressed hard on his neck. The rope hung slack in her hand. He didn't need it anymore. Each movement seemed deliberate, a test of muscles not used to comfort. His hopes clicked against the wooden floorboards as he crossed the threshold. He paused to sniff the air, ears twitching at the scent of pine resin smoke, and something older, still the smell of home. He took one faltering circuit around the room, his body swaying as though deciding if the place remembered him as much as he remembered it. Then, with a sigh that sounded almost human, he folded down beside the stone fireplace, his legs bent stiffly scarred, tissue pulling at the motion. But at last, he lowered his head onto the familiar boards. The firelight glowed faintly across his dark coat. For 3 winters, that corner had been empty. Claire stood frozen, her gloved hand still on the door handle, staring as though she might wake to find it an illusion, but it wasn't. He was here, her storm battered and scarred, yet alive. Something inside her chest cracked open, and for the first time in years, the cabin no longer felt like a tomb. Later, when she had fed him hay and rubbed the stiffness from his legs, she went to the old trunk in the corner. Its lid creaked as she lifted it, releasing the faint smell of leather and dust. Inside lay relics of a life she had sealed away. Worn tack bridle with a missing buckle, a saddle whose leather had darkened with as in use. She lifted it carefully, brushing off the layer of dust that dulled its sheen. The saddle was marked with scars of its own scratches from branches, indentations from years of riding of fun, faint scorch on one flank where ash had once settled. She ran her fingers over the grooves, memories flooding in. She remembered the long patrol Storm stride steady beneath her as they climbed switchbacks lined with pine. She remembered the way he would toss his head and whinny when a herd of elk peered on the ridges, nostrils flaring at the wildness in them that matched his own. She remembered a spring storm, a sudden flash flood in a canyon, the two of them scrambling together for higher ground, soaked and shaking, but alive. Storm had been more than a horse. He had been freedom untamed, strength given shape, and when she lost him, she had lost that piece of herself too. That night, after she had laid the saddle back in its trunk, Claire crawled into bed. The fire crackled low. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin, snow hissing against the window panes. Sleep came heavy. In her dream, fire came back. She was there again in the canyon, wind turning to heat smoke devouring the air, trees cracked like gunshots. Storm screamed a wild, heart-rending cry, and then his form dissolved into the smoke swallowed. Whole. She ran after him, lungs burning, shouting his name until her voice broke. Claire jolted awake. The room was dark shadows thick across the ceiling beams. Her night shirt clung damp with sweat. She pressed a hand to her face, shuddering. Her throat rasped with a whisper, "I should have saved you." Beside the hearth, Storm shifted in his. Sleep, a low groan vibrating in his chest. His ears twitched as if he had heard. Morning brought a knock at the door. Claire blinked into the pale light, surprised. Few people came out this far without reason. When she opened it, Margaret Hayes stood on the porch, cheeks flushed red from the cold. She balanced a basket in her mittened hands, a folded blanket draped over one arm. "Good morning," she said, slightly out of breath. "Thought you could use something warm. Blackberry bread just baked this morning." And this, she lifted the blanket. "It's old, but thick, might keep." The chill out. Claire hesitated, unused to visitors, but stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." Hayes ducked inside, stomping snow from her boots. Her eyes swept the cabin and then froze. "Good Lord," she breathed. The basket nearly slipped from her hands. "That horse!" Storm had lifted his head at the sound, ears flicking. He regarded Hayes with steady, watchful eyes. "You know him?" Claire asked carefully. Hayes swallowed, nodding. "Not personally. But one of my students drew him." Claire frowned. "Drew him?" "Yes." Hayes set the basket on the table, her voice low, cautious. "A boy in my class. Quiet, keeps to himself. Last week, he turned in a drawing. A black horse, scarred on the left shoulder. The mark looked exactly like that." She gestured toward the pale slash across Storm's side. Claire felt her stomach knot. "Which boy? Hayes? Sugarhead? I probably shouldn't say, but he's not the sort to invent things. I thought it was imagination. Now I'm not so sure." Storm pushed himself upright, his body trembling slightly, then settled again. Claire looked at him, then at Hayes, her mind racing. What had the boy seen, and how Hayes seemed to sense her thoughts? "There are things the children notice," she said softly. "Things adults dismiss, but sometimes their eyes are sharper than ours." The ranger said nothing but unease, coiled in her chest. That evening, as darkness reclaimed the valley, Claire sat at the table, writing her patrol notes. The only sound was the scratching of her pen, the pop of firewood, and Storm's steady breathing by the hearth. Outside, snow fell relentless, blanketing the world in silence. Then Storm jerked upright, his ears pricked forward, his nostrils flaring, his muscles bunched as though every nerve in him had caught fire. A deep rumble built in his chest, rising into a sharp, piercing whinny that filled the cabin. Claire dropped her pen, heart hammering. "What is it?" Storm's hooves struck the floorboards, pounding once, twice, 3 times. The sound reverberated like warning drums. He faced the door eyes, locked on the darkness beyond. Claire rose slowly, every sense alert. She grabbed her flashlight with one hand, her service pistol with the other. The air in the cabin thickened, charged, with something unseen. She pushed the curtain aside and swept the beam across the yard. Snow gusted, sideways flakes flashing white in the light. Trees bowed under the wind, their branches groaning. A limb cracked and fell, shattering into the drifts. But nothing moved that shouldn't. Still, Storm would not settle. He stood rigid, tail-lashing ears pinned. His breath steamed in the cold air spilling through the door frame. "Easy," Claire murmured, stepping to his side. She pressed her palm against the strong arch of his neck, feeling the tremor there. "Shh, it's all right, I'm here." But even as she whispered, she knew it. Wasn't all right. Storm wasn't spooked by wind or trees. He had sensed something human perhaps, or something he remembered, a smell that didn't belong in the wilderness. The Mustang's body trembled, not in fear, but in readiness, the way soldiers stiffened before battle. Claire's eyes scanned the night, but she saw nothing. And yet, the certainty coiled in her gut. Cold and heavy. Storm's return was no accident. His scars told of more than fire. His warning tonight was more than nerves. Something had followed him back into her life. Something dangerous. She closed the door and slid the bolt of the weight of the lock, feeling far too thin between them and the dark. Storm lowered his head at last, though. His ears stayed sharp. His body blocked the door as if to guard her. Claire laid her hand on his shoulder, her voice quiet but steady. "Whatever's out there, we'll face it together." And though the cabin was warm with fire, light, a chill settled in her bones that the flames could not drive away. The morning sky was clear, though thin. Clouds promised more snow by nightfall. Claire set out as she always did, boots crunching through the brittle crust, breath pluming white. Storm moved alongside her, his gait uneven but stronger than it had been days ago. Each step seemed to pull life back into him, muscle by muscle, stride by stride. She had planned to take the South Ridge Trail, a path she knew by heart. But Storm resisted. The Mustang tossed his head, tugging reins toward the east. His ears pinned forward, his chest heaving as if some scent had caught in his lungs. And, refused to leave. Claire frowned, tugging lightly back. "What is it?" she muttered. Storm pulled harder, a snort bursting from his flared nostrils. His eyes were wide, focused on something unseen. Claire hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, lead the way." They left the familiar trail and followed the line of abandoned tracks that cut through the outskirts of town. Soon, the landscape shifted. Snow swallowed fences, weeds pushed through. Broken asphalt and rusting rails vanished into shadow. Ahead, looming over the white drifts, stood the old freight warehouse. The building had squatted there for years, ever since the timber company folded and left the valley. Its roof sagged, its walls stray with rust. Weeds bristled through the cracked pavement around its foundations, tattered. Posters, rodeos, campaign slogans from a decade ago peeled from the walls. The place breathed neglect. Storm halted a few paces short, nostrils quivering. His ears twitched violently, hooves stamping at the frozen ground. A low sound rumbled in his throat, a half snort, half growl. Claire's chest tightened. She laid a hand on his neck. "You know this place," she whispered. The Mustang jerked his head toward the heavy doors. His body trembled with tension. The door resisted at first. The wood had swollen from years of moisture warped against its frame. Claire shoved a shoulder against it, grunting, but it didn't budge. Storm stepped close, shoving his weight against the panel with a sharp snort. Together, they forced it open, hinges screaming in protest. Inside was darkness. The air was thick, with a smell of oil, gasoline, and horses' sour sweat, layered with manure long dried. Claire clicked her flashlight on. The beam sliced through shadows, revealing stacks of wooden crates shoved against the walls. Thick rope bindings bit into their edges, rough and stained. She stepped closer. Stray hairs clung to the fibers, horsehair, unmistakable. She bent fingers, brushing the core, strands, and her stomach turned. On the floor, the dirt was scuffed with drag marks, long, heavy trails where something had been pulled, resisted, fought. Hoof prints pressed into the grime, jagged with panic, mixed with the tread of boots. "Jesus," she breathed. Her light found the far wall, and her pulse jumped. A map of Jackson Hollow had been tacked there, paper curling with damp. Red ink marked circles across it. The school, the church, the train yard, the community center that had burned last year. Each pin stabbed like a wound. Claire raised her phone and snapped photos quickly, her fingers shaking. Storm stomped the ground behind her, his ears flattened, teeth bared in a low squeal. He struck the floorboards with his hoof, once, twice, 3 times, as if demanding she look. She swung the beam to where he pointed. A crate sat half hidden in the shadows. Its lid was gouged with a symbol, ugly hooked curve, carved deep into the wood. Claire froze. Her eyes darted to Storm. His scar glimmered in the flashlight, puckered and twisted across his shoulder in the exact same shape. A brand. She staggered back, bile rising in her throat. "That wasn't an accident," she whispered. Her hand hovered near the scar on his hide, her voice breaking. "They marked you like property." Storm's breath came ragged, his sides shivering. He pawed at the ground, striking the crate again as though trying to crush it into splinters. Claire's pulse roared in her ears. The map, the crates, the brand. None of this was random. That evening, she pushed open the door of Dale's tap room and the old wooden bar on the top corner of Main. The air inside was stale with smoke and fried grease. The dim light, softening years of scuffed floors and scratched tables. A handful of men hunched at the counter, their voices carrying over the clink of glasses. Claire spotted Jed Hawkins in his usual place, a corner booth near the wood stove. He was 70th a day, wiry shoulders, slumped under a worn canvas coat. His face was cut with lines deep as canyons, his eyes milky from too many winters and too much whiskey. She slid into the booth across from him. "Jed." He blinked, then grunted. "Ranger Dawson, I need to ask about the old Raylord," she said quietly. For a moment, he said nothing, only took a long swallow from his glass. Then his voice rasped low. "You don't want to be asking. I already am." His eyes flickered toward the bar, then back. He leaned closer, his breath sharp with liquor. "Trucks," he whispered. "Black ones, no plates, engines running cold. Come. At nights when the snow's thick. They don't park under lights. They don't make noise, but they're there." Claire's stomach nodded. "What do they carry?" Jed's smile was bitter. "That's the question, ain't it? What needs to move in shadows? Never in daylight. Not hay, not lumber, not anything clean. Why haven't you told the sheriff? Jed's laugh was hoarse ugly. Boone knows always. Has told folks to keep their noses out, and we listened best we could. You'd do well to do the same. His glass clinked against the table, ending the conversation. Claire sat back, her heart pounding. Boone knew the words echoed in her head, all the way home. The next morning, Claire stood in the classroom of Jackson Hollow Elementary. The smell of crayons and chalk hung in the air, bright against the gloom of her thoughts. Margaret Hayes met her at the door, her hands full of papers. I wanted to show you something, Hayes murmured. She led Claire to a corner desk stacked with drawings. The children had been told to sketch whatever came to mind during free period. What they produced made Claire's chest tighten. Black trucks, angular and menacing, sketched in dark crayon. Rows of cages, horses, penned behind slats. A long peaked roof building that looked far too much like the warehouse she just stood inside. One drawing in particular froze her. At the bottom scrolled in jagged letters, "Don't tell." The words had been scratched out with a thick red line, as if erased in fear. Claire swallowed. Where would they see this? Haz's eyes were troubled. I asked myself the same. They don't invent these things, Claire. They draw what they see, what they overhear. They tell the truth the only way they can. Claire ran her fingers over the paper, the wax crumbling faintly under her touch. Fear had shaped those lines. Fear that was real. That night, back at the cabin, she spread the photographs across the table. The map from the warehouse, the marked crates, the children's drawings, every thread tangled into a web she could no longer ignore. Storm stood beside her, his breath steady, but his body taut. Now and then he turned toward the door, nostrils flaring, catching scents Claire couldn't detect. His scar caught the lamplight like a brand of fire. Claire stared at the pieces until her eyes blurred. Jed's warning, Boone's silence. The hook-shaped mark carved into wood and flesh. The black truck, slipping in under snow. The terrified hand of a child scrawling words he wasn't supposed to write. She touched Storm's neck, feeling the warmth beneath her palm. They thought you disappeared, she whispered. But you survived. And now, her throat tightened. Now, the truth is coming for them. Storm's ear flicked at her voice. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. The Mustang lifted his head high, and Claire felt the same certainty pulse through her veins. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The storm came like a living thing. Wind howled across the valley, rattling the shutters on Claire's cabin. Snow hurled itself against the roof and walls with the violence of thrown stones whistling through the cracks of the eaves. The world outside vanished, swallowed in white. The radio on her counter buzzed with static before the dispatcher's voice broke through blizzard warning. All residents remain indoors until further notice. Repeat, remain indoors. Claire moved to bar the door, tugging the heavy beam into place. She had survived storms before. The only way through was to ride them out, keep the fire fed, the roof patched, and wait. But then the call came. The radio hissed again. A man's voice, high and uncertain, spoke over the line. "This is Harry from the diner. I was closing up when I heard it." Sounded like a child crying out by the old railard. I swear I heard it over the wind. I didn't see anyone. And I can't go back out there in this blizzard. Somebody should. The voice broke into static. Claire froze. A child out there in this. She glanced at Storm. He was already pacing the cabiner's prick tail lashing. His body moved with restless urgency, hooves clattering against the boards. He let out a low guttural whinny, circling the room like a caged animal. When Claire stepped toward the door, he stomped hard once, twice, as if commanding her. "You heard it too," she murmured. The Mustang's eyes burned with intensity, fixed on her, as if to say, "We can't wait." Claire pulled on her ranger's coat, thick wool lined with fur, strapped her pistol at her hip, slung a coil of rope across her shoulder. She shoved spare blankets into her pack. The wind shrieked as she opened the door, but Storm surged forward without hesitation, chest squared against the blade. "Gale." Claire followed her voice, swallowed by the storm. "All right, partner, let's go." The world outside was chaos. Snow slashed sideways, each gust a whip against her cheeks. Drifts had already swallowed the road, rising to the wheel wells of her truck. She tried driving first headlights, cutting only a few feet into the swirling dark, but the tires spun useless in the deepening snow. Cursing under her breath, she abandoned the truck, pulled the emergency lamp from the cab, and swung onto Storm's back. He moved slowly, muscles straining, but every step was deliberate. Claire could feel the power beneath her, even through his weakness, the determination to keep moving. He angled his body against the wind-broad chest, breaking a path shielding her from the worst of it. She tucked her face against his mane, eyes narrowed against the sting. Every breath filled her mouth with frost. Branches cracked overhead, bowing under the weight of ice. The beam of her lamp swung wildly, catching only glimpses of the way ahead. Bent trees, white dunes, fences half buried. The storm reduced the world to a tunnel of light no wider than a horse's stride. Yet storm pressed on steady as bedrock. Claire found herself whispering into the bed. Dark. If it were just me, I'd never make it. Not tonight. The horse's ears twitched at her voice, though he did not falter. By the time they reached the outskirts of the railard, Claire's legs were numb from cold. She dismounted stiffly, leading Storm through the bent chain-link gate. The yard stretched before them, ghostly in the swirling snow rows of abandoned box. Cars, their paint peeled, their wheels frozen in place. The warehouse loomed behind them, its silhouette a crooked shadow in the storm. The wind carried faint sounds, scraping, clanging the eerie groan of metal under strain. But beneath it, Claire heard something else. A hiccuping sob. She raised her lamp, sweeping the beam across the snow. At first, she saw nothing. Then, Storm jerked his head toward the far wall, ears pinned. He moved ahead, hooves crunching against the ice until he stopped at a sheet of corrugated tin leaning against the warehouse's base. Claire followed. The beam caught movement. Something small curled against the wall. A boy. He couldn't have been older than 10. His hoodie was soaked through jeans, stiff with frost. His arms wrapped tight around his knees, his face blotched red and blue from the cold. His lips trembled as his wide eyes snapped toward the light. The boy tried to push back, pressing himself into the corner, shaking his head. But Storm moved first. The Mustang lowered his head, nostrils flaring, and let out a sound so low and soft it was almost a hum. The boy froze. His eyes darted from Claire to the horse. Slowly, hesitantly, one trembling hand reached out. His fingertips brushed Storm's tangled mane. The Mustang stood, perfectly still, warm breath curling over the child's skin. The boy let out a shaky sigh. The sobs ebbed. Claire knelt, lowering the lamp so the light fell gently over them. "It's all right," she said, voice steady. "You're safe now." "I'm here." The boy's eyes brimmed with tears, but he nodded faintly. Wrapped in, one of her blankets. His voice came holding words sticking in his throat. My name's Dylan Carter." Claire tucked the blanket tighter around him, holding the lamp steady. "All right, Dylan, you're gonna be fine." He shook, his head violently, tear spilling. No, they'll come back, they'll find me." "Who?" Claire asked softly. The men with the trucks, black trucks." His voice cracked, breaking into hiccups. "They told my dad. If he didn't help them, they'd take me away. They'd hurt me." Claire felt her blood go cold, colder than the storm itself. "What kind of trucks, Dylan? What did they make your father do?" "I don't know." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Boxes, heavy boxes." He said not to ask, but I heard them talking. They said the sheriff knows. He lets them. The words punched through her like a blow. Boone, it fit. Jed's warning, the map in the warehouse, the children's drawings. Now, here was proof from the mouth of a child. Dylan pressed his face into Storm's neck, his voice muffled. "I ran when they said my name. I thought they were coming. For me. Storm. He found me. He saved me." Claire's eyes burned, though, from cold or anger. She couldn't tell. She stroked the boy's hair gently. "You did the right thing, Dylan, and you're safe now. I promise." Getting him home was the hardest part. Claire boosted Dylan onto Storm's back, then climbed up behind him, wrapping her arms tight around his frail body. She held the blanket close over his chest. Storm shifted under their weight, then squared his shoulders, snorting steam into the frozen air. "Take us home, boy," Claire whispered. The Mustang stepped into the storm. Each stride was measured careful, but unyielding. His hooves broke through drifts, his massive body cutting a shield against the wind. Dylan pressed against his main eyes, shut tight, while Claire murmured encouragement into his ear. The storm howled around them, lashing their faces. But Storm moved as if some inner compass guided him, never faltering, never straying. Hours seemed to stretch in the blinding's white, until at last yellow. Light shimmered ahead, a lantern glowing in a window. Margaret Hayes's house. Hayes opened the door before Claire could knock. Her eyes widened at the sight of Dylan, cradled in Claire's arms, his lips pale, his body trembling beneath the blanket. "Good heavens," she gasped, rushing forward. "Bring him in quick." Inside warmth wrapped them like a quilt. Hayes pulled another blanket from the sofa, tucking it tight around Dylan's shoulders, then hurried to the stove, pouring cocoa into a mug. "Drink, sweetheart," she urged, pressing the cup into his hands. "You're safe now." Dylan's teeth chattered as he sipped, but color began to return to his cheeks. Hayes looked at Claire, eyes demanding answers. "He said his father was forced to work for them," Claire said quietly. "Said the men drive black trucks and that the sheriff knows." For a moment, Hayes said nothing. Then, her face paled, eyes flicking away, as though afraid the walls themselves might be listening. "I've seen the drawings," she murmured. "Children sketching trucks, cages, things they shouldn't know. I wanted to believe. It was just imagination. But maybe." Her voice trailed outside the window. Storm stood in the snow, his coat drenched steam rising off him in the porch light. He didn't shiver. His head was high, his eyes glowing with something fierce and certain. Claire looked at him, her throat tight. "You led me to him," she whispered, "and to the truth." The Mustang stamped his hoof once against the ice as if to answer. The next morning dawned with a brittle, deceptive calm. The blizzard had spent itself in the night, leaving the streets of Jackson hollow coated in a crust of ice and snow that glittered beneath a pale sun. The air was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every sound stand out sharper than it should. Claire tightened the scarf around her neck and made her way toward the elementary school. Storm followed reluctantly at her side, Hooves, crunching the hard snow. She had tied him near the fence, but even as she entered the building, she could feel his watchfulness behind her, like a steady heartbeat in the background. Inside, the corridors were warm and smelled faintly of chalk and crayons. Children's voices drifted through closed doors. Spelling lessons recited multiplication tables, the occasional burst of laughter. It should have felt safe. But Claire's stomach coiled. She hadn't come only to check on Dylan. She wanted answers. The teacher's office was dims, half drawn against the glare of snow. Margaret Hayes stood near the desk, her hands clasped in front of her like a shield. Dylan sat just behind her. Head, bowed, shoulders hunched, as though he wanted to vanish into her shadow. And across from them stood Sheriff Harold Boone. Boone was a big man, the sort whose presence filled a room before he spoke. His winter coat was black wool, heavy, and tailored with a sheriff's badge, still gleaming proudly at his chest. His jaw was square, silver hair combed back in a precise line. He looked every bit the image of authority, of law and order, carved into flesh. But the words spilling from his mouth were not law. "These drawings," Boone was saying, his voice low but sharp. "The trucks, the barns, the cages, none of this belongs in a classroom. They are children, Margaret. Children invent stories. And you allow this nonsense to circulate, you'll spread panic, fear. We can't have that." Hayes shook her head, her voice tight with emotion. "Sheriff, they didn't invent these things. They drew what they've seen, what they hear whispered at night. They're trying to tell us something." Boone's eyes narrowed, his lips, curving into something that was not quite a smile. Children are impressionable. Adults should know better than to fan the flames of their fantasies. The room thickened with silence. Dylan's small hand clutched at Hayes' sleeve. Claire's breath slowed, her anger coiling into a sharp point. She stepped through the doorway, boots striking the wood floor like gunshots. Boone turned his head at the sound. His expression flickered. Something unreadable quickly smoothed into practiced calm. "Ranger Dawson," he greeted, his voice too warm to be sincere. "Good to see you here." Claire's eyes were cold as stone. "Why," she asked, "is the sheriff of this county so concerned about children's drawings?" For a heartbeat, Boone's smile stiffened. Then he chuckled, shaking his head as though amused. "Because those drawings carry weight. Fear spreads faster than fire in a town this small. And you, of all people, should know how dangerous fire can be." The jab landed sharp, a cruel reminder of the inferno 3 years ago. Claire didn't flinch. "If there's truth in those drawings," she said, voice low and cutting, "and then they're not the danger, ignoring them island." Boone stepped closer, his shadow falling across her boots. His eyes gleamed with disdain. "Truth," he echoed. "What truth?" "A frightened boy who wandered into a storm, a few horses with scars. You're chasing ghosts, Ranger." Don't mistake them for facts. Hayes pressed her lips together, silent. Now, her gaze darting nervously between them. Dylan trembled, shrinking behind her. The child's fear spoke louder than words. Claire held Boone's gaze. Neither blinked. When Boone left the office, a few minutes later, the tension followed him like smoke. His boots thudded heavily against the hallway floor, his breath visible in the frosty air as he stepped outside. That was when storm erupted. The Mustang had been tied near the fence, head down snow, dusting his mane. But the instant Boone's figure appeared in the yard, Storm lunged forward on the rope, eyes blazing, his ears pinned, flat, his nostrils flared, and a sound tore from his throat, a scream of rage. So loud, it rattled the windows. Children inside the classrooms leapt to, their feet crowding to the glass. "Look!" one shouted. "The horse is mad at the sheriff." Storm pounded the ground with his hooves, each strike a thunderclap against the packed snow. His breath came in furious bursts, steaming in the air. His body trembled with fury. Every muscle taut eyes locked on Boone like a predator sighting its prey. The sheriff stopped short, his coat whipping in the wind, his jaw clenched to the practiced mask slipping for the first time. For an instant, a flicker of raw anger, or was it fear crossed his face? "That animal Boone," growled his voice, carrying sharp across the yard, "should have been shot years ago." Gasps rippled through the children at the windows. Hayes, who had followed behind, covered Dylan's ears instinctively. Claire stepped between them, her hand on Storm's bridle, her body a barrier. Her voice rang clear. "He's reacting to something real. He can smell it. Horses don't lie, Sheriff." Storm screamed again, the sound reverberating off the school walls, echoing into the trees beyond. The entire yard felt electrified air crackling with the tension of predator and prey of truth, straining against silence. For the first time, Boone's composure cracked. His hand tightened into a fist inside his glove. His eyes slid away from Storm's blazing stare. Claire watched every detail, Dylan clutching Hayes's coat with white knuckles, Boone's jaw twitching the horse's unrelenting fury. Piece by piece, the puzzle slid into place. Jed Hawkins's warning, the red marks on the warehouse map, the black truck slipping into the yard at night, the children's frightened sketches, the sheriff demanding silence, furious at a horse that refused to forget. He didn't just know, he was part of it. Boone exhaled, slow measured, but his voice came edged with steel. "Don't look for trouble, Dawson. Some things are buried for good reason. Best leave them there." He turned heavy boots, crunching the snow, and walked away. The children whispered feverishly behind the windows, eyes wide. Dylan buried his face against Hayes's arm. Claire kept her hand on Storm's neck, feeling the thunder of his heartbeat beneath her palm. His body remained taut, his gaze never leaving Boone's retreating back. She leaned close, her whisper meant for the horse alone. "That's him. He's the ghost we've been chasing." Storm snorted, stamping once his breath, a cloud of steam that curled into the frozen air. And Claire knew the time for silence was over. The memory of Boone's words still clung to her like smoke. Some things are buried for good reason. Best leave them there. But Claire Dawson had never been one to leave things buried. That night, long after the town's lights had gone dark and the wind moaned through the timber line, Storm refused to rest. He circled his pen with restless energy, snorting, stamping, pacing in tight lines. His body trembled as though every nerve pulled him towards something unseen. Claire stood by the gate, lantern in hand, her breath frosting in the frigid air. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Storm stopped, ears pricked eastward toward the railard. He let out a short, urgent whinny. She knew he was leading her back. The warehouse looked different under the moonlight. Shadows sprawled across its walls like ink, the roof groaning under the weight of snow. Sheets of tin clattered in the wind, loose bolts whining with each gust. The air wire faintly of rust and old oil, the scent sharper in the cold. Storm halted in front of the side wall, head bowed low, pawing at the frozen ground. He struck the concrete with his hoof again and again, snorting clouds of white. Claire frowned. She crouched, setting the lantern down, and rapped her knuckles against the surface. Solid here, solid there, then hollow. Her chest tightened. "You found something, didn't you?" She dragged a crowbar from her pack and wedged it into a crack in the cement. The slab resisted at first, groaning like an old hinge, then shifted with a gritty scrape. Dust plumed into the air as a narrow seam opened, revealing an iron hatch, nearly invisible beneath years of grime. Her heart hammered as she pried it. Wider. Cold air breathed up from below, damp metallic tinged with machine oil. A hidden stairwell. Claire gripped the lantern and her sidearm, then descended. Storm followed Hooves clanging against the steel steps, his breath steaming in the confined dark. The cellar sprawled beneath the warehouse like a hidden vault. Rows of metal shelving lined the walls, stacked, with crates slicked in grease and sealed with rope. The acrid stench of gun oil burned her nose. Weapons lay, wrapped in canvas, tagged with numbers. But it wasn't the guns that stopped her. Breath. On a central table, files were piled high, ledgers, thick with names, dates, shipments. She flipped one open, scanning page after page. Horses, wild Mustangs, identifications, brands, head counts, notes of capture dates, destinations, buyers listed in distant states, even overseas. She turned another page, her hand trembling. God Almighty, she whispered. They sold them whole herds, whole generations. Her voice cracked. She pressed a hand to her forehead, fighting nausea. The flames of that wildfire 3 years ago returned in her mind. Her herd gone, Storm lost. They hadn't died in chaos. They'd been erased. Storm let out a low, mournful nicker, as if echoing her grief. His scar glimmered in the lantern, light proof. Claire forced herself forward, snapping photos with her phone. Every page, every signature. The evidence was ironclad. That was when the shadow moved behind. Her. The blow landed hard, sending stars across her vision. She gasped, the lantern clattering to the floor, its light spinning wild across the walls. A man loomed out of the dark black tactical gear face, hidden behind a masked steel baton, raised for another. Strike. Claire staggered, trying to bring her pistol up, but the world tilted. Storm screamed. The Mustang lunged, muscles exploding as his hind legs lashed out. Hooves connected with the man's chest in a brutal crack, hurling, sent him backward into the shelves. Crates tumbled, clattering like thunder. The intruder groaned, mask slipping askew. Claire steadied her weapon light, catching his face. A gaunt, hollow-cheeked man glared back at her eyes, fever bright with panic. He spat blood and hissed. That horse. His voice broke into a scream. That horse should have died in the fire. Claire froze. The words cut deep, slicing through the storm of her thoughts. He knew. He knew Storm. He knew the fire wasn't an accident. Her grip on the gun tightened. Storm's body trembled beside, her eyes blazing. The man clawed for his weapon, but Claire stepped forward and cracked the butt of her pistol against his jaw. He slumped unconscious. Her breath came ragged. She pressed the radio at her shoulder. "This is Ranger Dawson. Deputy Mallory, I need you at the Raylord now." Deputy. Ethan Mallory arrived 20 minutes later, his cruiser crunching to a halt outside the warehouse. He strode in with his rifle, shouldered suspicion clear in his eyes. "Claire," he began, voice edged with frustration. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble?" Then he saw the hatch. He followed her down the stairs, and his words died. His gaze swept the shelves, the crates, the weapons gleaming under, the lantern light. Then the files, named signatures, lists of stolen Mustangs. He picked one up, leaped through his jaw, tightening. "Holy hell," he whispered. Claire pressed the thickest folder into his hands. "This isn't rumor anymore, Ethan. This is organized. This is slaughter disguised as commerce. And our sheriff's fingerprints are all over it." Mallory hesitated, his young face pale, caught between disbelief and certainty. Finally, he exhaled, slow, his voice heavy. "All right, I believe you from now on." He looked her in the eye, nodding once. "I'm with you." Behind them, Storm snorted, stamping a hoof against the concrete as if sealing the pact. By dawn, the evidence filled the back of Maller's cruiser. Files stacked in boxes, seized weapons, tagged and bagged. The unconscious intruder sat cuffed in the holding cell by the time Claire entered the precinct. She and Mallory spread the documents across the desk, comparing them against state records. The pieces fit too perfectly. Shipments of captured Mustangs, transport dates matching reports of missing herds from the Bureau of Land Management, signatures on clearance forms forged, except for a handful. Those bore identifiers only someone within law enforcement would know. Mallory's face darkened as he traced a line with his finger. Only a sheriff would have access to these codes. Only Boone. Claire nodded grimly. He staged the fire, covered their tracks. He made the town believe it was nature when it was murder. Mallory's hand curled into a fist. "We bring him in today. The interrogation." This room was a small gray box, lit by a humming fluorescent bulb. Boone sat at the table back straight, his large hands folded in front of him. His coat hung on the chair behind him, damp with melted snow. Sweat dotted his forehead, but his eyes still carried their old defiance. Claire placed the files one by one across the metal table. Photos of crates, shipping logs, the attacker's testimony, and finally, Storm's photograph, his scar bright against his dark hide. Boone's jaw clenched at the sight. "You wanted him gone," Claire said, voice hard. "Burned with a herd, didn't you?" The sheriff's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. Mallory slid a clearance form across the table, tapping the corner with one finger. "This is your code, Harold, your signature. These records put you inside that warehouse 5 times in the last year." The silence stretched until it snapped. Boone exhaled heavily, shoulders sagging. At first, he muttered, it was just a favor, helping a friend move stock, no questions asked. But the money, the promises, it got bigger. They had buyers across state lines, across borders, and the horses kept coming. His voice broke into bitterness. "You think I wanted it this way? I was. Keeping the town alive, making sure the wrong people didn't look too close. You let them burn a herd alive," Claire hissed. Boone's eyes lifted hard and desperate. "I didn't strike the match, but I gave them the chance. That's all it took." The weight of his words fell like stone. The fire, the smoke, the screams, all of it had been sanctioned by silence. When Storm was led past the interrogation room window later that afternoon, Boone's facade cracked entirely. The Mustang stopped turning his head toward the glass, his dark eyes locked on the sheriff's, silent, unyielding. Boone palled his composure, unraveling. He looked away, muttering under his breath, voice thick with dread. "That horse, it survived. It'll bury us all." Claire stood, her voice firm, rigging in the sterile room. "No, he survived too. Prove the truth doesn't burn. Not even in your fire." Mallory scribbled the final notes into the report, his expression grim. Boone sagged back into his chair, defeated, the strength gone from his frame. Outside, Storm lifted his head to the winter sky and let loose a ringing whinny, a sound rolling across the yard like judgment. The walls of silence that had bound Jackson Hollow for years were cracking at last. By morning, the cold had sharpened into glass. News moved even faster than the wind through Jackson Hollow, slipping under doors and across countertops, leaping from porch to porch the way frost creeps along window panes. The Gazette hit stoops with a thud at dawn, front page black with a headline that seemed impossible even as people read it aloud over coffee. "Sheriff Harold Boone arrested, evidence found in hidden cellar Mary at the general store." Read the lines twice, then a third time, mouthing the words as if repetition might change them. At Dale's tap room, men who'd worked with Boone on search parties and parade routes set their mugs down with careful hands. Mothers paused outside the school scarves halfway to their children's chins. The story fell over the town like fresh snow, soft and suffocating, beautiful and terrible at once. "Thought he was keeping us safe," a rancher murmured outside the hardware store, steam curling from his mouth. Turns out he was only keeping himself safe. If not for Claire and that horse, someone answered, we'd still be in the dark. We'd still be feeding the lie. People shook their heads. Some swore, some cried. The first shocks bled into something heavier, disappointment than resolve. Silence had kept Jackson Hollow intact for a long time. Today, something else held it together. The stubborn agreement that things had to change. Boone left the precinct between 2 deputies, his wrists pinned with steel. He looked less like a figure of authority and more like a man who had fallen through the ice and could not find the hole again. His boots slid on packed snow. His eyes, once so sure, could not settle on anything. A crowd gathered without planning to. They simply found themselves standing there, woodcutters with sawdust still on their sleeves, shopkeepers in aprons, a pair of teenagers in puffy coats, the mail carrier with a canvas bag thumped to her hip. Angela Carter stood near the edge, arms wrapped around her son so tightly he squeaked. Dylan's cheek pressed against his mother's coat, eyes wide, not quite believing daylight could hold this much. Truth. Boone paused at the top of the steps. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no. Words came. Someone in the crowd spat. Someone else turned away. Mo said, "Nothing." That quiet was the town's verdict. Claire kept to the side, Storm's rope in her hand. The Mustang exhaled breath pluming in the air and watched Boone with a predator's stillness. Beside Claire stood Deputy Ethan Mallory, jaw set, the muscle in his cheek ticking. He'd signed the paperwork with a hand that trembled for only a second, then steadied. Never. I thought I'd be the one to put cuffs on him, he said under his breath. None of us did, Claire replied. Angela bent her face to Dylan's hair. Tears wet the boy's crown. When she lifted her head, her gaze found Claire. She stepped forward, touching Claire's sleeve with a trembling hand. You brought him back to me, Angela said simply. I can pay bills. I can. Bake bread. I can't repay this. You don't have to, Claire said. Just keep him warm. Keep him safe. Dylan wriggled free and leaned up to Storm, small fingers brushing the Mustang's cheek. I knew you'd find me, he whispered as if telling a secret to a star. Storm's ear flicked. He lowered his head until his muzzle rested against the boy's shoulder, an anointing, a promise kept. Around them, phones buzzed with updates. The state was issuing warrants. Partners of Boone, names that had never belonged together in the same sentence, were being picked up in 2 counties. The network that had felt invisible the day before now unraveled out loud thread by rotten thread. The town did what towns do. When the ground shifts under them, it gathered. A notice went up at noon. Chalk on the blackboard outside the cafe. Handwritten flyers on the church bulletin board. A single sentence over the radio between weather reports and highway closures. Town Square, Saturday noon. By the time the hour came, sunlight skimmed off crusted snow like a river of glass. A small platform had been hammered together from lumber. Dale Morgan kept behind the bar for fixes, which always turned into projects. Flags snapped in the wind. Children huddled in groups, their cheeks pink and eyes bright with the thrill of a day that felt like the end of something, and the start of something else. Claire stood behind the platform, adjusting Storm's bridle. The Mustang's coat gleamed despite the scar that scalloped his shoulder like a crescent of old fire. He had put on weight these last days, gathering strength the way the forest gathers snow quietly all at once. Ready, she murmured, fingertips pressed to the pulse that thudded under his jaw. He snorted, as if the question were beneath them both. Mayor Edwin Royce, small man, big bow tie nerves. He hid behind an abundance of words, stepped to the edge of the platform and cleared his throat. The murmurs thinned. Neighbors, he began, we've had a week that'll be told and retold to the next generation until they sigh and say, yes, Grandpa, we know. A small ripple of laughter warmed the air. We were misled by someone we trusted, and we were rescued by someone who does not speak our language and by the one who listens to him. He gestured to Claire and Storm. Ranger Dawson, if you'd bring your partner up here. Claire led Storm up the step. The wood creaked under his weight, but he moved with the same composure he'd carried through smoke and blizzard. The mayor held up a new saddle, dark leather, clean lines. On its left side, a small oval badge glinted. Guardian of Jackson Hollow, he read aloud. Some titles are not issued by any office. They are earned. He clipped the badge to the saddle and buckled the cinch hands. Careful, reverent. Children shrieked with delight, clapping small hands until their gloves thumped like muffled drums. Adults cheered, some with tears running, silver in the cold. Storm stood with one ear, caned the other, folded the scar clear as a page, turned at the corner. He did not bow. He did not need to. He only breathed slow and steady, as if accepting the weight of the honor and finding it lighter than the burdens he already carried. Mayor Royce stepped back. Today we remember what a town is, he said, voice roughening. Not a badge, not an office. A town is the people who refuse to look away. Hayes was in the front row, cheeks ruddy hair, springing free from her knit cap. She wiped at her eyes and grinned fiercely. Mallory stood 2 steps behind, hands clasped at his back. The new steadiness in him settling like a foundation. Angela held Dylan at her side, the boy's hands fidgeted with a piece of folded paper. Excitement sparking off him like static. When the applause faded, Claire stroked Storm's neck, feeling the smooth heat of living strength. She had nothing to say to the crowd that would be better than the truth already said. She bowed her head instead. It was enough. The square emptied slowly, conversations blooming and fading like little fires as people drifted toward errands and home. But 4 figures, 5 counting the horse, broke away from the rounder, last knot of neighbors and followed a narrow lane up the hill. The hilltop cemetery was small, more a ring of stones than a field. Snow lay pure there, a wide sheet of white broken by the dark fence and the evergreen line of pines beyond. In the middle, a low granite marker glinted. The inscription had been cut months ago, when the town first acknowledged the scope of the wild herd's loss. In memory of the horses of the basin, untamed, unbroken, unforgotten, Claire carried something wrapped in linen, against her chest. The parcel had weight, but it was the kind of weight that steadies rather than burdens. She'd carved at it late into too many nights to count the shape rising from the wood, with each patient pass of her knife, as if the figure inside had only been waiting to be uncovered. At the marker she knelt, unwrapping the linen. The statue emerged storm in miniature. Head lifted, main wind caught one ear, tipped a delicate line of scar engraved. Along the left shoulder, the wood was smooth as riverstone, where she had rubbed it with oil, the grain glowing like something living. Hayes gasped softly. "Claire, it's beautiful." Ethan said nothing. He didn't have to. He tipped his head the way men do when words aren't quite large enough. Together, they set the carving beside the stone. The wind stirred the trees, and a pale slip of sunlight angled down through the big clouds. It caught on the statue's lifted face and on the letters cut into the granite, a gilding, both with the same small mercy. Hayes placed a ring of winterberry and pine at the base. Ethan removed his hat. Angela folded her hands and bowed her head. Dylan stepped forward, last tiny boots squeaking in the snow. He pressed his palm to the wooden horse's neck. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. None of you, are. Storm stood behind them, the real against the carved, the living against the remembered. He breathed out, and his breath drifted over the statue like a blessing. Back at the square, the wind cut sharper, and people began to scatter with promises of soup and bread and wood stoves that needed tending. Dylan tugged on Claire's sleeve. "I made something," he said, ears ringing. "For you, for you and him." He wrestled a folded sheet from his coat, flattening it against his knees. With mittened hands, wax colors flashed gold, green, blue. He held it out, eyes brilliant with shy pride. Claire took the drawing carefully, as if it might shatter. A sun poured itself over a row of small houses and a single and tall pine. In the middle, a woman with hair pulled back sat a black horse with one bent ear, and around them people held hands. Stick figures, yes, but unmistakably townsfolk. At the bottom, in large uncertain letters, Dylan had written, "You storm and our whole town." Her throat tightened, the page blurred, then sharpened as she blinked the wet from her lashes. She crouched so she could look him in the eye. "Family isn't only blood," she said softly. "It's what we choose to protect." Hayes's hand found Claire's shoulder. Ethan nodded, that simple final nod that meant, "I hear you, and I agree, and I will be here." Dylan smiled so hard his eyes nearly disappeared. Days later, the weather broke. The sky was a clear enamel bowl, cloudless and cold enough to make teeth ache. Snow squeaked under Hooves. The mountain stole the breath from the horizon again, blue and indifferent the way they had been before and would be long after. Claire saddled Storm in the pale morning, the new badge on the saddle catching light in small stubborn flashes. She checked the cinch twice out of habit, patted his neck, and swung up. They took the northern trail, the one that cut toward the ridge line and then wound back along the edge of the basin. The world felt newly drawn, the lines cleaner, the colors truer. Storm moved with a stride, Claire recognized, and had thought lost, confident, measured, eager, without haste. The scar on his shoulder gleamed faintly under the winter sun. His ear tipped and flicked, listening, always listening. The pines breathed their resin into the air. A hawk lifted off a fence post and spiraled upward, black against bluer than true sky. Somewhere, water murmured under ice, a secret that could not help telling itself. Claire inhaled. The cold slid down her throat like a tonic. For the first time in a long time, the space inside her chest was not filled with unsaid words and undone things. It was filled with wind and light, and the steady rhythm of hooves on frozen earth. They crested the ridge. The town lay below chimneys, smoking roofs, shining. The square, a scuff of footprints, and the faint suggestion of a platform already half buried by new snow. She thought of the boys who would grow into men who understood that silence can be a weapon. She thought of girls who would learn that truth once found feeds like fire. She thought of a teacher with a fierce heart, a deputy with a steadied hand, a mother and her son. She thought of the herd that had not been allowed to live and the horse who had refused to die. Storm flicked his tail, and for the first time in years, Claire laughed, brief, bright, like a crack of light through a locked door. She leaned forward, fingers tracing the bent ear she once knew so well, tenderness rising in her hand as naturally as breath. "Let's see it through," she whispered. "Let's make sure it holds." The trail bent, swallowing them into the forest. Snow stitched itself with signs of life, fox embroidery, elk punctuation, rabbit and weasel signatures written in silence. Storm read them in a language older than maps, his body answering to an instinct that had survived fire and time. No gun barked, no siren pierced. Only the echo of a chainsaw far down the valley, too small to be menace, too ordinary to break the spell. For a moment, quiet returned, not the smothering quiet of secrets, but the clean kind. The kind that breathes steady, like a heart freed from a fist. In the years to come, people would argue the story in kitchens and bars, on church steps and snowy porches. They'd fight over details: the color of a badge, the number of trucks, which night the storm raged hardest. They'd forget names, invent others, but they would all remember the feeling. The night justice didn't thunder in with sirens or steel. The night it came on four hooves, scarred and stubborn, led by a woman who refused to look away. Storm was not merely the horse who survived the fire. He was the ember the blaze had failed to kill, the coal glowing deep in the ash until Claire's hand cupped it and breathed life again. Together, they carried truth through the dark, until the silence of Jackson Hollow cracked wide enough for the light to enter. And yet, justice never comes without cost. Some swore they saw shapes on that last ridge, not just Claire and her Mustang fading into the timber, but other shadows, watching from the tree line. Eyes that had hoped the fire had buried its secrets forever. Eyes that now knew the silence of Jackson Hollow had been broken. The sun slid lower, brass on snow, the wind combing pines into a restless hymn. Then the shapes vanished, as all shapes do. But in the hush that followed, there lingered something more than hoofbeats and unfinished promise, and the sense that this story was not yet done. Because sometimes, the end isn't an ending. It's the warning before the next storm.